Panhellenic games or Panathenaic games? What's the difference exactly? Well, allow me to give you a bit of a brief overview. I'll start with the Panhellenic games. As you can see from the map, there were 4 of them. There were the games at Delphi, Isthmia, Nemea and Olympia, perhaps the Olympia games being the most famous, as you may well know them as the Olympic games. But they were each slightly different. Each of them had their own suite of events. And broadly speaking, with Olympia and Nemea, you have the athletic and the equestrian events. And at Delphi and Isthmia, you have these, but you also have what you might think of as artistic events as well. So, for example, poetry, singing, musical events, and apparently even painting. In terms of dating them, that's always tricky when it comes to Olympia. The Olympic Games are very difficult to date in terms of when exactly they started, and I think I've covered that in previous videos. The short of it being, those victor lists really only account for the earliest known victor. They don't really say when it all started. In fact, there's a lot of debate as to when anything happened at Olympia, because cult activity in honour of Zeus goes back to the 10th century BC. And earlier on, in the Olympic Games, it was just one event, a foot race. So it's difficult to say exactly when it started. That aside, the Delphi Games, the games at Isthmia and the games at Nemea seem to have had starting dates in the early 6th century BC. Though they differed in how they were structured and even what events they had, there were some similarities. For example, if you were Greek, you could participate in these. It didn't matter what ancient Greek city or colony you came from, you could participate in any of the events. And the other thing is that you didn't win anything other than glory and a crown. So those famous crowns, for example, Olympia, the olive wreath that you got, at Delphi, a laurel wreath, at Isthmia, originally apparently a wreath of pine, but then wild celery, and at Nemea, it was a wreath of wild celery. This is what you won. But you might also get that sort of fame manifested in a statue at your hometown or city. And perhaps that was enough for many people. I'd be pretty chuffed with that. And now I come to the Panathenaic Games. This was held purely in Athens, and it was very much Athens focused. It debuted apparently in 566 BC as part of a wider festival, and the idea being to really put Athens on the map. And it kind of makes sense because you had those other games going on elsewhere, and of course at Athens this was in honour of Athena. In terms of the events, well, these encompass pretty much everything. You had equestrian events, so the chariot racing, horse riding, you had the athletic events, but then you also had the artistic events, included poetry, singing, that kind of a thing. And you also had the manliness competition as well, though I'm not exactly sure what that was about. Sounds interesting. And in the events, you can actually see one of the central differences between the Panathenaic and Panhellenic games. Because at the Panathenaic Games, in certain events, you had to be Athenian, so they weren't open to all Greeks. The other events were, but just some of the events were restricted to Athenians only. But perhaps the biggest difference was what you won, because here you could win large amounts of olive oil, but also cash, which obviously differed from the Panhellenic Games. And we have lots of Panathenaic vases, such as this one, which shows an equestrian event where people are throwing javelins at a target. And these presumably held some of that oil that you could win. But of course, you also won, well, glory as well. But, you know, you could also spend it.